together in breakout rooms before we jump into content. But for this session, we're actually going to do that later in our time together. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Elsie Parks, who's going to kick us off. And over to you, Elsie.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thank you, Alice, for inviting me to moderate this panel. It is my hope that this space that we're creating together can feel as relaxed and flow as much as possible. But what I wanted to do before to help open up this space and open up this way that we'll be sharing with each other this evening is a little practice that I got from a close friend. His name is LL, called the invitation. And with the invitation, we just want to open the space with some intentions and invitations. And with each invitation, I want you to take a deep breath and let them in and let them settle into your system. There's about 8 of them. So I'm also doing this to help ground myself. And so hopefully it'll help you feel grounded in this shared space that we're holding together. That is very precious. We give thanks to the lands that we are on. We humbly ask permission to be here and give thanks for the abundance of this land, which was stolen from Native Indigenous people. We invite the ancestors who have fought for justice in small and big ways in the spirit of resistance to be present with us tonight. Without them, we would not and could not be here. We invite all to hold space for the tragic loss of life that has happened this year and honor the love and labor of the folks that are holding communal grief. We invite all to be present with and in the conversations. Our experiences all differ. We are not just ourselves, we are made in relationship to each other. Activate your imagination, activate your empathy. We invite you to honor each other's humanity, and we are all interdependent. We invite you to be curious and ask questions of yourself and each other. Speak from your own real experiences and do not speak from others that you do not represent with integrity. We invite you to bring your authentic self, to contribute your energy and brilliance, vulnerability with boundaries. Keep it real and feel each other. We invite you to take care of yourself during this conversation. Talking about race is not neat or tidy, but messy and emotional. We are all part of creating what exists today, the hard and the abundant. This is not a space of shame or blame. Let's take one more good deep breath in. And let those intentions and invitations settle into your spirit. Thanks, y'all. I'm Elsie again, and I use she, her, and honey as my pronouns, and I'm honored to moderate this panel and to hold space for the stories that will be shared with our incredible panelists, full of freedom fighters, cultural bearers, land stewards, community organizers, and advocates. And everyone will have an opportunity to introduce themselves, but I did first want to begin to say that unfortunately, Mr. Hollis Watkins will not be present with us this evening. We were so looking forward, and I believe he was looking forward to participating in the space and being able to share his wealth of knowledge and wisdom. And we're just willing his comfort and his wellness. He has dedicated most of his life to the struggle of racial and economic justice, community organizing, leadership development, and world building, especially through his efforts with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He also served as the director in the Organic and Sustainable Agriculture Program of the Mississippi Association of Cooperatives, which is part of the Federation of Cooperatives. Was a founding member of Southern SOG, the Sustainable Agriculture Working Group, before founding Southern Echo in 1990. And like Mr. Hollis, Suzanne Farr is also here with us tonight. And they are both representing or are represented on the National Council of Elders. Suzanne is an organizer and a strategist who helped to found and steward several organizations that have meant the world to lots of folks in the South, including SONG, Southerners on New Ground, the Highlander Center, Project South, and from what I hear, he's still very active within the Southern Movement Assembly. With that, I definitely am going to say more about the other panelists, but I did want to give Suzanne an opportunity to offer any reflections that she had about Mr. Hollis, because unfortunately, just so that he can feel present with us.
Great, great. I am just so sorry that he was not able to come tonight. I know that was hard for him because he is such a committed worker for justice. And Hollis and I have had a relationship over time that has been really meaningful to me. We worked side by side the 5 or 6 years that I was on the board of the Highlander Center, and then when I was director of the Highlander Center, he was that person that you could always depend on for the truth, and that you could always depend on, that he had deep roots and experience that would bring the work to a focus in the way that most people can't do that. But for those of you all who don't know him, he is a giant in the civil rights movement. The work that he did and the sacrifices that he made were extraordinary. You should read his book. It just came out last year, I believe. And you'll hear in that those experiences, and see the what it would mean to be in Parchman Prison, what it would be to be virtually tortured there. And then to create this amazing organization, Southern Echo, which is extraordinary in that it has done more, I think, to sort of work across the South to get people to understand racial and economic injustice, also to understand how the government affects us, what it means to face gerrymandering, what it means to try to lift up public schools in the face of privatization of schools. I could just name thing after thing after thing that they've done, but they are one of the organization that makes up the heart of the South, I think, in our social justice work. So I could say far too much about Hollis, so I'm going to stop so that you have time to do this introduction and have the conversation you want to have tonight.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for those reflections. They mean the world to me. And as Suzanne was naming, Hollis has a book, do a little bit of research. I'm definitely a part of his legacy. And I believe that we all are. And both Mr. Hollis and Suzanne have both served Southerners through their offerings to build and steward institutions and sustain the hearts and minds and spirits of all of those that follow. So just really, really grateful, especially to you, Suzanne, for being present with us as an esteemed elder, um, a righteous one too. So it's also my honor to share space with Magali. She'll be introducing herself as well, who is stewarding a worker-led organizing for human rights for poultry workers, who are essential workers, and has been standing alongside her community just this morning, who walked out demanding for safer working conditions, and has been present with her folks all day. And so just Magali, thank you so, so much for extending yourself, not just to the people that you care about, but also just burning the, what do they call it, the midnight oil, and being present with us tonight, and honoring the commitment that you made to be able to share your stories and experiences. We also have Ramsey that is here, who has been doing powerful advocacy work across the Gulf South and modeling through embodiment, land-based rural living as a return to the earth and as a return to our homelands, and represent another Gulf is possible, and I'm sure a number of other things that I'm sure you will share in your when you introduce yourself. And the South is made better because of all of the love, labor, and offerings of each of our panelists. So yes, just thank you. So each of our panelists has intimate and experiential wisdom and practice along various aspects of the food supply chain, or the food system as we know it, and the land and the land-based resources that we all depend on, and have made tremendous contributions to the producers and the workers, the people and the communities that make it possible for all of us to eat and live. Our aim is to learn from these legacies, repair and shed what no longer serves us, and remember and reimagine what it will take to shape our shared future on the land. That's from the workshop description. But the portal that has opened up in 2020 has required us to learn, adjust, adapt, and connect in ways that we weren't doing before. And I'm just trying to kind of frame our conversation for the evening, but there are large aspects of the US food system that are broken, that are toxic, and that are exploitative of people and the planet. And that is foundationally made possible on the stolen land of Indigenous people, the stolen labor of Black folks, and made current on the exploited and stolen labor of Latinx people. As was named in the description of this session, race-based oppression is foundational to our food system, past and present, and is a wound that we all carry through, though in different ways. And yet we can only heal what we are first able to name and understand. And this panel invites us to be a witness to the experiences that will be shared through story. And it is our hope that we as people will be able to see beyond ourselves and belong more deeply to each other and to nature, and will help us shift towards more collectivism, more justice, and more abundance. So with that, we're gonna get into the discussion. Suzanne, Ramsey, and Magali, if you all will please make sure to introduce yourselves in whatever glorious and beautiful way that you would like to when you answer the first question that I have for you, which is simply, whose shoulders do you stand on? Like, what is the spirit and the legacies that have brought you to this work, and that you have stewarded yourself? And I'll start with you, Suzanne.
Okay. I want to say one thing that I forgot to say about Hollis. I told you I could talk too much about him. which is that if he were on this call, I think he would sing, because that's one of the things that he always does for us. He's a great cultural worker on top of being a great organizer. So let me see how I can answer that question in a short way. It's hard for me to start in on it because, you know, when Alice asked me to be on this panel, I started thinking about the theft of Black land. That was the first thing that came in my mind, you know, by the government, by financial services, loan sharks, redlining insurance, you know, land that African Americans had created with the skills and, you know, the knowledge that they brought from Africa and put into place here, that, you know, where they became enslaved and created the sort of the foundation for wealth for white people and for profit. And so, you know, I spent a lot of time thinking about the future of the South when, you know, 6 million of the skilled descendants of slaves, you know, moved to the North after the Reconstruction. And then I thought about how this was happening while I was growing up. And so that sort of leads me into describing this, because when I think of whose shoulders I stand on, you know, I stand on the shoulders of, I think, my mother and father, who came from generations of immigrants coming from Ireland, and, you know, and they came into the country generations back and came through Appalachia into Georgia. And they were basically, you know, hardworking and religious and scrappy and stubborn, self-reliant, very community oriented. But they lived in a way that I think we now call mutual aid. And I think that's sort of a theme for me tonight, is what it means, what land means, and what community means, and how those two are connected. I was born at the end of the Depression and at the beginning, end of the Depression, and yes, at the beginning of the Second World War. So I stand on the shoulders of that generation of people, the people who survived the Depression and survived the war. But I really stand on the shoulders of my mother and father, who also represent that generation that came into that with what it released in this country. Now, they had 8 children and worked a dirt farm with mules in Georgia. And I think that was on Cherokee land. And so growing up, I witnessed how they were centered in family, in church, in religion, and the survival through hard work. That was sort of what knit them together. And what I saw through them is that land is culture, you know? Land is not just a place that we walk on, that we use for, you know, some of our worst purposes, that carries culture in it. And the culture that I grew up in is that we lived off bartering, swapping, sharing resources such as a wheat threshing machine that the neighbor who owned it would bring it around, and it would take a cycle of a number of farms, and all the workers, the men who owned those farms, would go from place to place with it. My mother would feed 15 men who did the wheat. So we shared everything in community, the vegetables, hog killing, you know, bowls for reading, quilting, recipes, safety when they rang this iron bell that we had out on a pole in case there was a fire, shared birthing babies. I think that is mutual aid, not as we describe it now. It's mutual aid that is about everybody having a piece in it, everybody sharing a part. I worked in the fields, and as I grew, those values grew in me, and now I see them rising up again in this moment. I think they've always persisted, but I think this crisis It's brought the concept of community in a different way, of connection in a different way, and how we work with each other, not through charity, but through sharing, through bargaining, through, giving one bit of what I've got, you giving a bit of what you got, and surviving and thriving through that. So I will toss this to, who do I have? Magali. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me in this space. It's always an honor for me to share the work that we do here with poultry workers. And so I am originally from Mexico. I moved from Mexico to Arkansas, and my background is theater. So growing up in a city, 2 million people, León, Guanajuato. It's North Mexico City. And it's a very conservative city, very religious. And so I grew up with a lot of oppression, as being a woman and a very outspoken woman since I was a kid. I remember that when I was in kindergarten, I jumped into the fence because I hated that kindergarten and why I had to stay in a place that I was not feeling happy. So my family always remembered that anecdote, and they always think like, oh my gosh, if we knew back then that you would have become this revolutionary woman, it's because you are like that. And so I think then because of that, I found theater the only place where I could be free, where I could be many different characters and just enjoy myself with that and drain myself with different ways of being free. And so that meant a lot to me. I went to Mexico City to study theater, but then I ended up traveling here to the US, to Arkansas, to a very rural white community, very racist community. And I found myself very miserable for many years. It was a lot of struggle. And I wanted to pursue being an actress because that gave me freedom in my heart and in my soul. And I graduated from the University of Arkansas, but through that journey was the worst journey that I could have experienced with theater, because suddenly I became this woman that I was Mexican and brown with a very strong accent. And back then, when I was learning English as my second language, of course, I had a stronger accent. And so suddenly my identity was that. It was, first I was fighting for me being women in a society that tells you that women have very limited roles, right? And then coming here, I was fighting like, suddenly I am this person that everybody identifies me with, and I need to fit into this box. And to me, it was miserable. It was not what theater was to me. And I hated it. I didn't want to be an actress anymore, because I didn't want to be just put into this box of you have to do roles just as a brown woman and Mexican and with an accent. And no, I didn't identify myself like that. I wanted to do theater to free myself, not to put myself into a box. And so I became more involved with the community, and I found my second passion was to organize poultry workers, because I was working in this community clinic in Arkansas, where I heard all the horrible stories of poultry workers. And to me, I took it as if I had now a responsibility, because I already had heard these stories. And now it was about not just being upset, it was about like what we need to do now in this land where we are not welcome, where we don't mean anything. So what can we do, right? And so I bring myself into this work, that the fight, the resistance, that we should always fight for a different narrative, that the narratives that where we grew up doesn't mean that it's what it has to be your whole life, that we have to fight to free ourselves in our souls, in our minds, in our hearts. And so now I use theater to empower workers, and now I use theater and arts as a way to organize workers, as a way to empower their voices. And now I can see I see myself mixing that, the art that free yourself, your soul, and then using that as a tool to really free yourself from a society that tells you that you don't mean anything. So I carry with me that the power of breaking the rules and their narratives to free ourselves. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Magali. Ramsey, it's on you.
Stongo, everybody. Georgivka Oklani dos. Imadol wa Iganyi Falijados. Fusolgi Pachirowesh. My name is Ramsey Sprague. I am son of Bird Clan, and I live at Iganyi Falija, which is an all-native eco-village project in rural Coosa County, Alabama, outside of Weogolfki, Alabama, south of Silicata. The question of like where, who, what has inspired my path is really, you know, it's huge. Growing up Native, of course, just being acutely aware of racial injustice and the erasure of Native voices and stories, looking for spaces that provided large enough pluralist, at least spaces where, you know, the voices of abundance, the voices of the people are actually present, the voices of the majority of the people of the world could be heard beyond borders, beyond walls. Coming out of high school, I was very interested in renewable energy technologies and found that there was no traction where I wanted to go to school at the time. It was around the year 2001, if that ages me for y'all. And there was no college that had a renewable energy program in the South. I found out very quickly at that time, because federal dollars were tied up until 2006's energy bill, there was no research dollars going to universities anywhere in the country from the federal government for renewable energy. And I wanted to be working on battery technology and fuel cells and sustainable architecture and all of those things. So I, after a while of toying with an engineering program, dropped out of college and focused entirely on social justice organizing and activism and creating spaces for the type of pluralism that I wanted to find for my own voice, to foster not just my voice, but the voices of others in my community that felt similarly to me. And this is back in Fort Worth, Texas. I was raised in Arlington, Texas. I was born in Dulac, Louisiana, which is about as coastal as you can get without being in the Gulf itself. And I did that type of community organizing with a radical community center info shop type space for almost a decade, and ran a number of programs out of there, including a documentary film series that I held weekly, and we screened documentaries from all over the world, and many were on new technologies and, well, looking at older technologies through new, fresh eyes, right? Sustainability. And we were heavily influenced by a collective out of Austin, Texas called the Rhizome Collective. And there's actually a book that you can find that I went and grabbed off my shelf. I don't know if it's going to show up or not. It just looks like this. That's interesting. But it's called A Toolbox for Sustainable City Living by Scott Kellogg and Stacy Pettigrew. And it really opened my eyes towards, you know, what it does to reimagine urban spaces as agriculturally productive spaces that would look at the asphalt of a driveway and say that can just come out. That could look at the front yard or the green space of an apartment complex and say that could be a garden, and just reimagining what urban living could look like. Especially this was becoming more and more relevant to me as I was looking at and learning from people from all over other cities around the world, such as like Caracas, Venezuela, or Havana, Cuba. You would see urban spaces that are lush, that productive, and it's kind of the direction I feel like we need to be internalizing as producers ourselves. And of course, traveling through Guatemala introduced me to a number of rural types of readily available technologies, using natural building techniques to build comfortable living shelters in rural areas that could be used in urban settings if it were not for building code. And so shortly after returning from Guatemala, I had a very strong commitment to seek out those that were wanting to use these types of technologies in order to build community, and met my current collaborator with Egan Yifalija, Marcus Briggs Cloud, and his family. And through traditional Muskogee ceremony, found a community that was interested in forging a path ahead using renewable technologies and regenerative agricultural practices on indigenous homeland, and reclaiming that land and space, and all that comes with that, the responsibility of caring for the land in a traditional way, and honoring the ancestors and those that walked the land previously, in order to do so in an appropriate way, while also building a space that can provide sustenance for the culture and language, for the propagation of Muskogee people. And my thirst for social justice never stopped, and I found myself drawn to Alabama for the purposes of the Eco-Village, but also because of a commitment to work with indigenous communities, indigenous identified communities along the Gulf Coast, which eventually introduced me through a series of events, starting with protesting the Keystone XL pipeline in Texas, and looking for tar sands specific resistance in the Gulf South, and finding a community here called in Mobile, Alabama, called Africa Town, which was facing a very serious tar sands threat, and moving to Alabama from Texas at that time, more than 7 years ago, because of the work with the Eco-Village, and because of this connection that I was able to forge with elders in the Africa Town community, and their commitment to environmental justice for their community, and our mutual interest in stopping the expansion of tar sands exploitation along the Gulf Coast. Moving to Alabama made a lot of sense at the time, and I've been here ever since. And I hope that answers that. I don't think I gave any ancestors, but.
Well, that was perfect, Ramsey, and I'm sure Alabama is better because of you. All of you. That was beautiful. Thank you all for sharing your stories. I am by no means a substitute for Mr. Hollis Watkins, but we definitely wanted to ensure that the Black Southern experience was present on the panel. So I'll just take, I'm gonna kind of pop in and leave where I can. I certainly was not prepared to do so because we found out not too long before we started the panel that Mr. Hollis wasn't going to be able to be with us. But I'll take this opportunity to introduce myself a little bit more. I identify as a Black agrarian cultural worker and a farmer organizer. I am a child of the South. I am a native of Atlanta by way of Augusta, Georgia, by way of Lincolnton, Georgia, which is where my ancestral land is. I'm the granddaughter of educators, sharecroppers, and land stewards. And I am a product of my mother line. My mother's name is also Elsie Parks, Elsie Dolores Parks, and my grandmother is Elsie Helen Pause Parks. And so I come from a beautiful legacy of Black women who were very active in community, who were raised on farms, and who just taught me so much about, through their embodiment, how to be of service to others. And part of what like charted my journey to growing, not only growing food myself, but also coming into relationship with Black farmers all across the South. So I would be remiss if I did not say that I stand on the shoulders of people like Mr. Hollis Watkins, because the Black farming legacy in the South, you know, as Suzanne was saying, kind of like was for, I mean, the enslavement of Africans that were brought here into the colonies were, you know, really because of the agrarian knowledge that Africans had. And yeah, so I feel like Black folks have a complicated relationship with land. And I started farming probably back in 2011 here in Atlanta, urban farming, and was able to come into deep relationship with a lot of other growers in the city. And through seeing the ways in which folks were highly under-resourced, did not have the ability to steward their land without it being compromised by the folks that owned the land, decided that we needed to organize ourselves and generate some resources to be able to resist some of the energy that was flowing through the city. And in 2017, I decided to that I wanted to grow deeper relationships with elder Black rural farmers. Moved to Louisiana, started organizing in Mississippi, and started working for SAFON, which is the Southeastern African American Farmers Organic Network. As well as I'm a part of Black Agrarian Workers of the South, which is a collective of land stewards and community organizers. And yeah, I wanted to name explicitly that Mr. Hollis Watkins, the legacy that was generated through legacy institutions like the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which is nearing its 55th year, as a place where cooperatives and mutual aid were a long strategy for Black farmers in the South, who were oftentimes the cornerstone of their Black or of their rural agrarian communities, not only providing nourishment, but also economic opportunities. And so, yeah, I wanted to name that in the space. And yeah, and thank you all so much for sharing so much of who you all are. Um, More aligned with the kind of framing of our discussion, the next question that I have, and we'll start with Ramsey, is from your perspective, how did we get here? And when I say how did we get here, just really getting a sense of food, land, food systems. I know I named in the framing of the space that there are a lot of things that are broken and exploitative about the food system, but from your perspective, how do we get here?
Well, you ask a Native person that question, and they're going to start with colonization. The colonization and the removal of the traditional caretakers of the land is how we got into the shape that we're in. The deliberate systemic exclusion of Native people as sources of knowledge for how to manage vast swaths of our, what is today wilderness, or vast swaths of what people might want to be wilderness, is how we got here today. The systemic racism that allowed that to happen ushered in the transatlantic slave trade, ushered in the hacienda system, the enslavement of Central American indigenous people in service of European and North American economies. All of these are intricately and intimately connected to the questions that we are facing today, from everything ranging from how do we address climate change in a sustainable way, to how do we stop the exploitation of people who are working simply without documentation and doing essential labor like Magali does. These are, it's all connected to race-based oppression, in my opinion, and the exclusion, the framework that allows for expropriation and stealing of land, stealing of people, stealing of dignities, and why we must continue to share in spaces like this in frank ways to say that this is how we got here. How we get away from here, I think, is the more interesting question. But what do you think, Magali?
Well, how we got here, it's been a mess. I don't know what we like, wow. Now many years to undo everything that was done wrong since the beginning. And well, here in Arkansas, I will talk about the perspective of how our food system really shift to now being so unsustainable for the environment, the animals, the workers, everything. And I think it had to do a lot about the power corporations that are having over the government. I think in Arkansas, I mean, we are in a right to work state, which comes with a lot of slavery legacy, that the idea that workers really don't have power or voice, but also like how the consolidation of corporations, in the states, in South states, to control the government. And that has led workers without any protections whatsoever, any voice, any sort of justice. And this year particularly, I think it's been very very evident, what we've been living before, but really what wasn't working and what is not working the most during the pandemic, and how we need to change that moving forward. And I talk about this because, I mean, the factory farming, and I talk about my experience growing up in Mexico. I think that the idea of owning the land, of having your own animals and grow them and raise them, and then you can sell them, you can have your own meat store, you know, carniceria. And so you could go every day to the meat markets and buy your meat straight from families that were raising those animals. But here, everything is so capitalized, you know, everything it's about how much production we get with less money, with less resources, how we get the most profit out of really investing very little and protecting humans, and protecting workers, and protecting animals and the environment. And it just, the industry really has grown so fast, and that suddenly we are stuck into this system that is not working, and we don't know how to do it, right? And so here in Arkansas, like we have Tyson. The Tyson Foods is one of the biggest meat packing plants in the United States, and we have Walmart. They both, and we have J.B. Hunt, which is transportation. So they three really control the government, but more so Walmart and Tyson. And everything that they've done really is to lobby the government to protect them over the people. So the government now acts direct, straightforward to protect the corporations. And this year was very evident, you know, how in the middle of the pandemic, this corporation had so much power over the government that they allowed or forced them to do these executive orders so fast and so done to protect the companies, and to give nothing, any ways to leverage justice of workers. And so we saw that this year, like in this year, the companies were lobbying the federal government and the state government. And it's important to also know, where are these workers coming from? Why they are in these rural areas? Why are refugees, immigrants immigrating to wide rural communities where really we don't have a space, we don't have a voice, we don't have a community? We're building our own community, but it's us protecting us, but nothing else outside to have any justice. And so in Arkansas or in the South, these corporations are eager for vulnerable workers. The most vulnerable workers are, the easy they are to be exploited. And the more isolated they are, they easily will locked up into these jobs, and these workers won't have any other opportunity or any chance to find another job. And so by these companies being in wide rural areas, it just gives this sense of workers don't have any power, and they don't have any other option but to work in these plants. And so immigrants in Arkansas began immigrating to Arkansas precisely because of these jobs. Many immigrants immigrated from California. Tyson was bringing illegally smuggling workers from Mexico to work in these processing plants. And really, for a lot of immigrants coming from rural areas in Mexico, it is probably identifies more with the calm instead of in a city, you know. Many immigrants found that they could buy a place here or rent an apartment rather than being so crowded in California, where multiple families had to rent an apartment to be able to pay the rent. So that was very attractive to immigrants, but they didn't really know that was very unbalanced, you know, that the job quality was bad, and it has been really bad. A lot of the immigrants, and this is what I taught when I began listening to workers, the stories of these workers, just like most of my community are injured for life. Many are disabled. And so for me, that was shocking to see that the amount of people being injured because of these jobs, and how little protections they have, or how little ways they had to fight their cases through workers' comp, with OSHA. Nothing is given to these workers. And so every year, these companies keep, because with this idea of capitalism is like every year they have to produce more, they have to make more. And just by that, that is just unsustainable. Workers right now during the pandemic had been forced to process 174 chickens per minute. During the pandemic, the companies made, or the USDA allowed these companies to increase the line speed. In a year where there is so much concerns about getting sick, about dying, and that's precisely why many meat packing workers have contracted COVID-19, and many of them have died. I mean, over 50,000 meat packing workers in the country have contracted COVID-19, and the number is very underestimated. I never knew in my life that whenever I wanted to organize workers, I will be right now counting deaths, counting how many workers are dying. And that has been really devastating for our community, because these companies seem to see these workers as expendable. They see them as they don't have any humanity, and they treat them as such. And so we got here because because of capitalism, and also because of these corporations have gained so much power. And really, for me, when I fight corporations here, I'm fighting the government, because they're pretty much the government in Arkansas, and they don't have any accountabilities. They place their own the governors, they only serve the corporations. Right now, there is no ways that workers can fight cases of COVID-19 if not through workers' comp, which is gonna be impossible for workers to gain or to win a worker comp case on COVID-19. So this is unsustainable. Every year, these companies will want more and more and more, and so we need to create ways and reinforcement mechanisms to stop that. So these companies are forced to adopt this code of conduct that we want to create with the supply chain and the power of consumers, really. Because we as the consumers have a power over what we buy, how, or what conditions. When people started being worried about animals because we saw how they were killed, and people got angry because of that, the companies began saying that they are treating them better, which is probably not true, but at least we can influence. I mean, not at least, what I'm saying is that we can influence them in a very meaningful way, that they still have a lot to do, but we have the power to tell them, like, we're not gonna buy your product if you're gonna treat these workers like that, right? And so this is the tool that we have under this capitalist country, that they are eager for profits. They are eager for continuously damaging our communities. And right now, I'm really concerned because not only immigrants are suffering, we have Asians coming. Now the governor welcome more refugees. And when I saw that, I knew that it was not because he was such a nice guy that he cared for refugees. For me, it was immediately a red flag of like, oh, now they're bringing refugees to put them to work in these processing lines, because these companies need vulnerable workers. And so, yeah, they are bringing more refugees to Arkansas, and most of them are now working for Tyson. And how these companies also control their churches, they control the nonprofits. And so that's why workers feel that they don't have any power. So when we created Venceremos, for example, and I'm very outspoken I speak the truth because I know what the workers are going through. And then now workers feel like they have an organization that is speaking the truth, that is not afraid of speaking or being outspoken against these corporations. And now that's why today they walked out. For the first time history in Arkansas, poultry workers are walking out of their jobs, demanding better working conditions. And it was not because they didn't want to before, or they didn't know how to do it before. It's because they felt so powerless that they felt like everything was against them. And right now they could see a little bit of like a light shining, you know, that we have hope and we will continue to do so. So yeah, I don't want to extend myself too much on this.
That was perfect, Maghalie. I feel like you really were able to actually answer parts of what the next question was, which is what are the folks in your community experiencing right now? But I did also want to give Suzanne an opportunity to answer the question, even though I do feel like, Suzanne, when you introduced yourself in the shoulders that you stand on, that you did kind of name some of the ways that, how did we get here? But I just wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to add before I start kind of trying to condense the questions a little bit, because you all have already offered so much.
Well, I wanted to say to Makali, we live in the same state. I live in Little Rock.
Oh,
And I
you know what I'm
want
talking about.
to tell a little bit. I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Georgia, but I've spent a lot of years in Arkansas, about 30 years. I just want to tell a little story that goes with that, but just to back up on, how we got from there to here. Native peoples and African peoples did not come and bring capitalism and work from that. That through the destruction of people, that we lost values of sustainability and care of the people, and then moved to industrialization and corporatization and technology through the road of capitalism. So from here to there, yes, power and profit. But the story I want to tell that's connected to yours, which is about my family. After the Second World War, the government was building ponds for white farmers, and for raising cattle and creating home demonstration clubs, and whatever. So people were feeling like they were beginning to inch out of severe poverty, but they didn't. And so in the 50s, the chicken industry came in. So this is where it's connected to yours. And so they started offering these small farmers this, they would build the chicken houses and provide the chickens, and then you raise them. You put your labor into those, and then you got a few cents on the pound. So that sort of moved into the 70s, where agribusiness started on the rise and growth of suburbs. And so people didn't just lose their farms because they stopped farming. Also, suburbs took over those spaces and those lands. So I ended up in Arkansas working for a very powerful small organization called the Women's Project that was here for 20 years. And while our commitment was elimination of racism and sexism, and that we'd never talk about one without the other. So it'd be racism, sexism, and economic justice. And so that's what we laid out. We were going to sort of keep the left alive in that. It started in 1980. By the time we got to the late 80s, here came two things: Tyson and Walmart, coming around the middle of the 80s. And so we ended up fighting both. Tyson was flying people in from Mexico to be workers illegally, and then putting them under the worst conditions possible. We tried to investigate those conditions had a hard time doing it because people were terrified to talk with us. Then it was largely white poor people working there, and then with people being brought in from Mexico trying to work side by side. The white people were particularly terrified. Most people didn't have language to be able to communicate the skills. And they described things like standing with what you call mail on your arms, which is like a metal grid to keep your arms from being cut off as you were cutting the chickens, to make sure you weren't slicing your arms, or you standing in a foot of water. Those were the working conditions. And then when they became injured, they were sent, of course, to the doctors that were hired by Tyson. And so there was never any comp, there was never any care. So that was one of our battles, was trying to raise up that, particularly there were women. We were always told when we would go to Northwest Arkansas to do this, that if you want good work, you hire native peoples to catch the chickens, because that's their skill, they would say. Then you hire white people and people from Mexico to work standing in the water, and they take and use Black people to slaughter. And so there was always this kind of racial divide. So we tried to expose that in every way we could. At the same time that Walmart was coming in, it became very, very clear within a very short time in the 80s that Walmart was going to move through the South, and it was going to take the place. It was going to actually disrupt cities and disrupt community life and change that forever. But what we took them on for was what we call the kind of pyramid that they did, that represented the country with this tremendous power on top and the workers at the bottom, and then what stood between those workers and having power. So we saw their practices as a practice of going into other countries, getting the cheapest goods they could off the backs of the poorest people who were working, and bring them here, pay their workers virtually nothing, and sell their goods to the poorest people. And of course, over time, that's how it worked out. And that Walmart did take over small towns in the South, and it did and continues to do its mistreatment of workers. And Tyson continues the same process today. And I think we're in that crisis moment where people are having a sense of revelation, where eyes are being opened, I hope, to what's happening. And people such as yourself are doing extraordinary organizing to make that change.
Thank you, Suzanne, and Ramsey and Magali. I feel like you all really painted a very full picture. The only thing that I would want to add is how much our current food system is modeled after the plantation system. That kind of evolved into the sharecropping system to be able to sustain that scale of agriculture, that oftentimes used, is also why our prison system kind of looks the way that it did, because that convict labor was the way to continue. If we're not going to be able to extract the labor for free, then we need the cheapest labor possible. And so I just wanted to make sure that I name that, because that is definitely a part of the Black experience. And as you were naming earlier, Suzanne, I think it was kind of around the turn of the century when I believe at least the Black population in the United States, around 95% of those folks were considered themselves farmers. And I think there's some statistics around, at one point farming over 18 million acres of land that they were owned and stewarded, and that has decreased significantly in Black farmers' ability to be able to sustain their families and their lives on the land has been directly compromised because of the companies, but also oftentimes because of government treatment. So, well, the last question that I had, we had another question, which was, how are your communities being impacted right now? And I feel like Magali especially were able to really shine a light on kind of like what's currently happening, but for the sake of time and for the sake of our optimism, what I'm going to get to the last question is where do we go from here? And how do we want to grow the world that we want? And I will start with Ramsey.
Well, ideally, we're talking about providing land back to people that that our society is thriving due to its expropriation and having been stolen. Short of that idealistic goal, we each have individual choices that we could make. However, big picture in terms of dismantling this model of corporate colonialism that we exist in today is really about recognizing the movement of wealth, how wealth accumulates among a few from a many, and ensuring that it is fallible, that, as Magali mentioned many times, corporations are treated with more rights than the average person. And that extends, everywhere from the Walmarts to the Tysons to the Archer Daniels Midlands to the Pfizers. I mean, in all of these elements, the accumulation of wealth and power by corporate interests of all shapes and colors, including, many of us are incorporated as nonprofits. We do these things to insulate ourselves from liability. Liability for consequences of our behavior shouldn't be something that is held as a fundamental good or a right. And ultimately, there's a philosophical challenge to the legal framework that we exist under as, why should an Exxon live? If an Exxon is a person, why is it living forever? Corporations under dubious legal frameworks are given human rights when they are not human, right? So there's a need to that I believe begins really with challenging the assumption that money is speech, and money is political speech particularly, that can begin to pull on this thread of this legal understanding that we seem to share implicitly in the design of our society, that corporate interests and moneyed interests are human interests, and that they can be treated separately. And in fact, up until the late 18th century, were treated separately, in law. And in fact, the 14th Amendment, which gave human rights to freedmen's, it was used many, many more times by the turn of the century by corporations to define their human rights than it was for freedmen to define the rights of Black humans in America, or Native humans in America for that matter. So this fundamental framework is a major problem, and it is our biggest hurdle, I would argue, to changing and to radically changing our food systems. Once we can get past this massive concentration of wealth, we can deal with the fact that there are people who wish to be living closer to the land, who can, in fact, live closer to the land, but need that, initial assistance in order to get land itself, to build their own homes, to live sustainably, and to work the land as they see fit, as perhaps traditional caretakers in their lineage would have, like we are trying to do with Igan Yifalija. But these are steps that we're taking to model what it means to embody our ideal behaviors as humans on this finite, this planet with finite resources, that we have this responsibility to obey what we were told to do on this land. And those with other backgrounds and good intentions can do that similarly on a smaller scale within each of their own individual domains. And those choices add up. And certainly as we network and learn from one another, how best to live our lives in ways that multiply our interests in seeing each other as fully formed human beings with rights that are greater than the Walmarts, the Tysons, the Pfizer's, Archer Daniels Midlands, the Monsantos, etc., that we can begin to challenge this assumption that the status quo is how we must adapt to, especially as we're facing the climate crisis. Some of these assumptions about the rights of corporations and the responsibility of corporations to return profit to shareholders, we have to do away with these notions in order to survive.
Thank you, Ramsey. Magali, where are we going?
Yeah, well, it's to undo all of that, probably, I don't know, it will require a revolution, really, with arms and everything, because yeah, I mean, just history has taught us that a lot of those changes, it requires to just do a revolution, right? But since we are not in that, we are a nonprofit as well. As Ramsey said, we are just stuck to what things we can do with our resources that we have. And also often organizations led by people of color have very limited resources, so we really do wonders with very little money, with very little resources. So to change all of what we have discussed today, it will require a lot more than what we have right now. And so through the journey of us fighting to improve working conditions for poultry workers, we in the last years been trying to figure out how to move forward with the campaign. And it is very important for me to learn from others, to learn what others are doing, to be humbled, right? Because often we always think that our ideas are the best and we are the best and everything. But for me, it's very important to always be on earth and always touch earth, and just to be humbled, to accept what I know and what I don't know, and or what I can learn from others. So in that journey, we ended up going to Immokalee, Florida, because I always knew that the Coalition of Immokalee Workers were doing amazing work on protecting workers' rights in that area. So we traveled to Immokalee, Florida to learn firsthand what these people were doing. And being there for a week, that time, the first time that we traveled, and then going to the fields with workers and knowing how the Fair Food Program works to protect their rights, it was like a sense of hope that we had. And immediately when I traveled with workers and we saw how it's working, the program, and how how the power of workers to even step up and to complain about it, because we in one day we went to this field and the coalition was given the education about their rights under their code of conduct, because really they had created a bill of rights for workers that are separated from the government, and they are richer and they are more, and they have a mechanism of reinforcement. And so when we traveled there, we saw that after the education, the coalition will often encourage workers to speak up, because that doesn't mean that the problems don't happen anymore, right? It means that there is solutions and there is a mechanisms to resolve the problems. There is no such a thing as a perfect world or perfect job, but it's important to have the mechanisms of how to resolve the problems that will come up. And so for me, it was very powerful to see that after that education, workers will come to the coalition and speak next to the boss and say, he was abusing us. The last week, this boss was telling in front of him as farm workers standing up in front of the boss and accuse him of being an abuser. To me was like, wow, these workers know that they are protected and that they can speak up that way, because then if they suffer retaliation, there is gonna be the solution to that. And so workers immediately were like, so can we adopt this formula to poultry? Can we use the same principles in poultry? And so yes, the answer is that obviously that program, the WSR, can be implemented in any industry. And so we began that journey because we saw how effective it is. And it's effective because the workers create their own code of conduct and how they want to see their workplace, a workplace free of retaliation, a workplace free of abuse, all of that. How is the dream of workers to put it in this code of conduct? And with that in mind, knowing how the power, the pyramid of power works, we have the workers, we have the corporations, these poultry companies that are often oppressing the workers, but who is on top of them? There is a higher power, which is the companies that buy that chicken. And on top of that, there is the consumer that buy that chicken. So we have a power of purchase. We have a power of purchase, and I have the power to say, I will buy this product. I won't buy this product unless it has these requirements, right? And so with that in mind, we want to create this code of conduct and bring that to the supply chain of these corporations and force them to adopt them, to then create this monitoring, because that's so important to have. Many times we believe that by corporations just signing a paper, they immediately are gonna do it. And that's not true. I mean, they have a lot of fake or empty promises that don't have any mechanisms on reinforcement. So the beauty of this program is that brings these market consequences if they don't follow through that, right? If they don't follow through the code of conduct. And so we believe that with this program, we could bring meaningful changes in the poultry plants, because if the company refuses to adopt this code of conduct, then there will be market consequences, and also to create a monitoring organization that will be in charge of implementation of the code of conduct, right? The complaints, to make sure that the code of conduct is followed. That is what we need to have access to the plants to make sure that they are doing meaningful changes. So this is the project that we have embraced ever since we co-founded Venceremos. And yeah, so this is what we believe it will bring, at least some justice to workers that seems to not have any justice right now. So yeah.
Perfect, Magali. Thank you so much for that. We definitely want to have everyone will have an opportunity to kind of like process some of all of these stories and this information during the last kind of portion, which will be breakout rooms. But I wanted to just be mindful of time. But I definitely wanted Suzanne to be able to make an offering towards how, how do we move forward before we close out this portion and yeah, get into the rest of our evening where we can talk amongst each other.
I'm just so taken by what Makali just said with the not how we move forward, but details of how you organize to move forward. I think that is extraordinary. It makes me so happy that this call has been recorded. I'll try to be fast and go just big, as opposed to right the opposite of what you just said. So I think that we have to have a radical revisioning of the life that we want, and the land, the way the land will be treated, the way the people will be treated, the way the country will build. And I think to do that, we have to. I think we have to do reparations. I think that we have to directly take on what has happened and what has been done, particularly to those who are descendants of slaves and those of native lands that were here and experienced the ravaging of those lands. And in that, we had to create a new agricultural economy and practice. It has to be re-envisioned, I think. And I think it can begin with reparations. That if you build the Black community's ability to buy land and farm it, for example, and restore ownership that has been stolen, I think you could begin to build a local infrastructure, and I think you can rebuild community. When I think of those millions of people who left the South, and their numbers were in the millions. How many of those were young people? How many of them were children? I think people are coming back South, and I think as we revision, I think we need to build programs that offer employment and opportunity to young people. And I think all of this, I think this is a huge amount is government funded and a huge amount is corporate funded because where the crimes are. And I think everybody has the ideas of what it would mean to restore, what it would mean to actually fulfill the 40 acres and a mule. Maybe it would be 40 acres and a large greenhouse and a local market, but to revive completely the commitment to land and community and to the past. I think we have to live our values, as was said. I know in the 80s, I wrote an article called Farming Our Politics, which was a metaphor for organizing and change. And I think that idea works, that the two are very connected of how we grow and how we change. And the other is to join those who are connecting. I think we need to connect with every group who carries our values and our vision. Not exactly the same, but it is connected. That we've got to build that vision. We've got to build skills and power. And I can't leave you without asking all of you to join us in the Southern Movement Assembly, which is our work across the South to try to do that. And there are other groups that are trying to do it. If we don't connect, if we work in isolation, I don't see very much hope for the change that we want. I think we have to recreate the world in a way that is connected, in a way that mutual aid is actually mutual connection and mutual commitment, mutual responsibility. So I have hope for that, but it's going to take us moving our our politics and our work in sync with one another as much as we can. Thank you. Thank you for having me on tonight.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you all. And you all uplifted so much about our connectivity. And as Magali said, you know, we're a little bit stuck in a system that's not working and don't really know how to undo it. But I feel like you all gave very concrete examples and very visionary examples of the ways that we can move forward, and just want to that Indigenous sovereignty and Black self-determination are inextricably tied. And that thank you all for offering like the system, but also offering some ways that we can be in the practice of more intimacy, more humility, and more reverence for the land and its natural resources, as well as for the wellness and the aliveness of all living beings. And there's absolutely the work to do to dismantle, and that's not everyone's work, but there's also the work to do to uplift and celebrate the ways that our culture and our resilience has sustained us outside of these systems. So again, Ramsey, Magali, Suzanne, thank you so much for offering so much of your insight and your wisdom. It was a beautiful panel. I hope everyone else thought the same. And I'm going to turn it over to, well, Rachel is going to turn off the Facebook Live. Oh, can you hear me, Rachel? Yes, okay. Marianne was in mid thought conversation when we got pulled out of the breakout rooms, and I wouldn't be surprised if that happened in the other space. Ramsey's leaving us. Thank you, Ramsey. You're amazing. So yeah, hopefully you all felt like little caucus space gave you a little room to breathe and felt generative. Rachel is going to play a song by Mr. Hollis to kind of ease us out of the evening. I just want to thank everyone for showing up in this space and showing up for each other and showing up in community. And I'm sure all of the beautiful ways that you do. And again, thank you for your vulnerability. I know we may have like opened up some spaces in our body because talking about race can feel emotional, but hopefully we've able to land that energy. And I'm gonna hand it over to Alice. Thank y'all. Appreciate you.
Great. Thanks, Elsie. So I want to just a couple of real quick things. First, I want to turn your attention towards Sarah, who has been graphically recording our session and can share real quick the beautiful art that she's been working on. So while she gets that queued up, I wanted to say the forum is still continuing for 5 more days. So we have some really wonderful sessions still lined up. If this is your first and you haven't read up on the other sessions, definitely encourage you to check them out. I'm going to drop the link in the chat. Oh, and my screen did a funny thing. And then also want to invite you to join ASAN. Oh, I'm going to pause myself because this is beautiful. Yes, Sarah. Loving it so much. This is so beautiful. I can't wait to read all the things. So yeah, want to make a note, if you please join ASAN, please become a member, renew your membership if you're already a member, and like bring your friends and family into this movement and this space and this community. And then I want to just say as well, I mean, I think part of the vision for this session was really to paint a picture of the ways in which like all our liberation is bound up together, right? And like really illustrate that we're so deeply interconnected and so interdependent, and sort of this myth of like individual success or individual sustainability is like a harmful and dangerous illusion, and like an illusion that we have to unlearn and root out if we're going to move the needle forward with this movement. And so, I mean, I think as Suzanne said, as Ramsey spoke to, like the arrival of colonialism in these lands and like the genocide of the people living on these lands and stewarding them in traditional ways was really like the rupture of any semblance of sustainable agriculture or sustainability that we might have had in this country. And so that's like the root we've got to get back to. That's like big work. And so, yeah, like we're in this moment of so many intersecting crises, and we have this opportunity to turn towards healing and liberation and community and solidarity. And like that movement, I mean, that work, that turning looks different for everybody, but it's like our sacred responsibility. So just want to appreciate all of y'all for showing up tonight for that work, and really deeply appreciate our panelists and ALSI for like being leaders and just such wise folks carrying that work forward. And yeah, it's like an honor to be in movement with y'all. So with that, I want to give a huge thanks to ALSI and to our panelists, and thank y'all for like co-creating this community with us tonight. This time and space has just, yeah, been such a gift. So we'll close with a short little poll. If y'all have been to these, you know the drill at this point. It's just 3 little questions to kind of let us know how we did. If you have more qualitative feedback other than just like 4 out of 5, please feel free to send Rachel or me a chat. We'll keep the chat open for a little bit. Or you can send an email to info@asanonline.org. But would love to hear y'all's thoughts about this session, about the forum in general. And to answer the question about the graphic, yes, we will absolutely share the final version of these graphics far and wide. Like, they're amazing. So you will see them on our social media and in other places. Yeah, and we'll be free to share them from there. So thank y'all again. Have a wonderful night.
Thank y'all. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night. Bye, Lisa.
No segregation.
Thank y'all.
No segregation.